Just so everybody knows, we're recording this to post it publicly at a later time. Press who've joined us, please put your questions in the Q&A, indicate your name and what outlet you're with, and we'll ask them at the end. And if you can direct them at one of the panelists, that would be great. So once again, my name is Brad Ashwell. I'm the State Director for All Voting is Local. All Voting is Local fights to eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting before they happen, to build a democracy that works for us all. Many are touting Florida's election this past cycle as a success story. From our perspective, there were many structural issues that confused and kept voters from exercising their fundamental right to vote. Beginning with the state's faulty online voter registration system and continuing with the suppression of many returning citizens. Floridians are now looking to their state legislators to ensure equitable access to the voting system. So today we'll discuss the upcoming Florida legislative session, which is already underway with committee weeks, but officially begins March 2nd. We put together a great panel of legislators and voting right advocates to talk about what they expect to see during the upcoming session. And we want to make sure everyone at home understands and knows how they can participate in the process. Before we start a conversation, I want to introduce our speakers. First, we have State Senator Annette Taddeo, who represents parts of South Florida, District 40 in the Florida Senate. Representative Geraldine Thompson should be joining us shortly. Representative Thompson represents parts of Central Florida, or District 44 in the Florida House. We also have Carolina Lopez, who serves as the Florida Elections Administration Consultant at America Votes. She also previously served as Deputy Supervisor of Elections of Miami-Dade County. And finally, we have Kirk Bailey, who's the Political Director at the ACLU of Florida. Once again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll get them at the end. So to get right into it, what did we learn about voting rights in Florida from the 2020 election cycle, especially given the additional limitations presented by the coronavirus pandemic? I'll kick it to Senator Taddeo first.
Hello, first of all, thank you so much for doing this and really appreciate it. It's a very important conversation and we definitely need to have it at this point in time. What did we learn? Well, I think as a state, we learned that people need to have access to other ways of voting. Clearly, vote by mail was something we've been using for a long time and has worked very well in Florida. And we've actually, made sure to put in some parameters to make sure it's safe and secure. And the drop boxes was a definite learning thing that just, it was very good that we were able to do that. I wish we were able to do more. I wish the supervisor of elections, and actually that's one of my bills, the supervisors of elections were able to just automatically, due to an emergency, send to everyone, not have to wait for people to ask for a vote by mail. That would be, something that they're right now not able to do unless you request it. So for that reason, I think, the fact that we still have returning citizens not completely able to vote after the voters clearly told us that they should. It seems, I said this today earlier at another event, I said, it seems like the legislature has a real bad hearing problem because, the voters vote for something clearly, and then we come here and we say, well, that's not really what you meant. For example, we did it with Florida Forever. We've done it with medical marijuana. We did it with ex-felons where they really should have that right. And now it's sort of like a state secret whether to get that information of how much money they owe, which was not even something that the voters were asking for. And now they're trying to, wiggle and mess with the minimum wage, which we just voted on. So that's why I say it seems like we have a hearing problem with voters. So, but what have we learned? We've learned that, we need to continue to fight because in Florida, I think there's a lot of things the supervisor of elections did such a great job in thinking outside the box. And like I said, to me, the biggest thing was the drop boxes, being able to do that.
Yeah, that was a huge success, I think. That was a legitimate success, I think. Carolina, I'll kick it to you next. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to echo what Senator Taddeo said. One of the biggest things, despite 2020 being such a special year, was the fact that in Florida, we had 3 very robust ways to vote, right? And so many SOEs around the state augmented outreach to voters saying, hey, these are 3 very convenient ways to vote. If you don't want to leave home, you certainly can. And one of the things about drive boxes, not only drive-up boxes, but like drive-through drop-off boxes were even another security measure in some states. So to be able to make it available to request a ballot, to be able to return it securely in person, and to do it without even getting out of your vehicle, that was just yet another way that some administrators were really responsive to the community and understanding it was a big year, but also, it's a way to make sure voters have accessibility.
Great. Kurt, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And I just want to, I think, pick up where the senator left off in her comments about returning citizens. I think we learned 3 things. The first one is about returning citizens, and clearly the state's opposition to the implementation of the Voting Restoration Amendment, Amendment 4 from 2018, their opposition to that measure and their requirement that individuals pay their financial obligations had the practical effect of suppressing votes. Probably more than 1 million individuals would have been eligible to vote, but for the state's position. And as it turned out, only about 72,000 returning citizens actually registered, and maybe 47,000 turned up at the polls. So, in the most cynical view of it, the state was very successful at suppressing over 900,000 votes. And I think when we're talking about access to the polls, that's the #1 thing that we learned about 2020, is that there were hundreds of thousands of people who would have wanted to participate in the process and did not have the opportunity to do so. And that's despite the other 2 points I'll make, which is one is about vote by mail, which I think we proved works. We proved it nationwide. We proved it here in Florida. I think it's something we've known for a long time. But even though it does work, it's still hampered by real problems around how the supervisors and other officials do voter education, how they match signatures, what they do when they cure ballots that are off. There are a whole variety of issues around vote by mail that could still be improved. And then the other thing I would raise is the one that folks have already raised about early voting sites. We've also, proven that early voting works, that people will avail themselves of it. But I think the thing that we did see in 2020 was a spike in voter intimidation that occurred during the early voting period, as well as during election day itself. We had lots of intimidation, folks, crowding the lines, threatening people, just activities like that I don't think we were equipped to adequately deal with, and we will need to do so in the future. Back to you, Brad.
Yeah, the one thing I might add to that is misinformation. We saw a lot of focused misinformation efforts, particularly targeting the Latinx community. I remember on election night, we actually caught wind of a robocall that was impersonating Gwen Margolis. And it wasn't from her office. And it was basically telling people they had an extra half hour to vote to throw them off. And just really deceptive practices going on. Moving into the next question, what has been proposed for the 2021 legislative session in regards to the right to vote? And Representative Thompson isn't with us yet, but I guess Senator Taddeo, if you could talk a little about the bills you proposed, that would be great. And what else you see coming?
Thank you. First of all, I have a few, but before I forget, I did forget about one thing that did happen that I think that we learned, that hopefully we learned, I should say, hopefully we learned. If you remember, on the day of the voter registration deadline, the website crashed. It was like the 4th time since that website was created. So, it seems like in Florida, we have a lot of problems with websites. But that, I think, hopefully that's something we learned, and it shouldn't happen. And it should be something that it was like a good problem to have that many people go and want to register on the deadline and leave it to us, always leave everything for the last minute. So anyway, I didn't want to forget about that, because I do hope we learned that lesson and that we're better prepared with our website so they don't crash when we have a lot of people go there. So having said that, I serve as vice chair of the Ethics and Election Committee in the Senate. And so I already had a bunch of legislation and drafting since way back as things were going on, and as I realized there were needs. Obviously, I have a bill, SB 798. I just spoke about returning citizens. This was specifically make sure that they're given the information when they ask, okay, how much money do I owe? It should not be a state secret. And when they have multiple counties, multiple jurisdictions, it becomes much more complicated for them to try to find out. I would like for the Department of State to be able to give them that information, and also be able to, if they don't give them within 30 days, then all is done. Like, they should not wait forever for this information. They've served their time, and that's what the voters' intent was. Who else? What else? SB 298. It's to allow the returning citizens to pay their court fees electronically. Something that we just don't seem to get with the program on anything electronic. SB 706. That is the one where when you apply or when you renew your voter registration, you automatically get registered to vote. So it would be, changing it a little bit, because right now you sort of have to, you have to click and you have to say that, yes, I want to register to vote. It should be like an opt-out, not an, automatic opt-in is what we want. And I think that's what the federal law really tried to do. And that's what's done in Georgia and in other places. And we need to make sure that we do it here, that we actually have people automatically registered to vote when they get the license or when they renew their license. I do want to mention one bill that I want to mention, since we're talking about this session. It's not one of my bills, but since I do have one about automatic vote by mail, just to allow, again, in cases of emergency, and I would like for us to switch to all vote by mail. I would love that. But the Chairman Baxley, the chairman of my committee, does have a bill, SB 90. I'm sure you guys have seen it. And I just want to make sure everybody pays attention to this bill, because this one actually, I think it's not a good bill. And I know he's the chairman of my committee, but it makes voting by mail, all these people that just signed up, we did so good. We, meaning we, democracy, and we had such huge turnout. And I think we had such huge turnout because people were wanting to participate. We should want everyone to want to vote. And this bill would make it for a calendar year only. So which means every single election cycle, we are going to have to reapply to get that vote in the mail. And that, to me, is a way to, again, suppress the vote instead of encourage more of the vote.
We've definitely seen that bill. And, I'll kick it to Carolina. Did you have anything you wanted to highlight?
Most definitely. And I think one of the other issues on that particular bill is that we would start from scratch. It wouldn't carry over, it wouldn't roll over existing vote by mail requests. So I can tell you from an elections administration perspective, that may be somewhat difficult to, just to start from scratch, coming off of such a very popular year with vote by mail and the millions of vote by mail forms, physical forms, and online forms that supervisors of elections already processed. I think that the best way I can describe in terms of legislative priorities, it's, we'd love to keep what we have, at least in terms of vote by mail, right? I heard earlier today in the House Committee on Public Integrity and Elections, it's the system that we have today was 20 years in the making, right? And it was in incremental changes to fine tune it and make it as accessible as possible. And from a voter perspective, I think if anything comes out of this session is to keep what we have, build on what we have, in terms of vote by mail enrollment and accessibility, expand early voting opportunities, be it giving supervisors of elections more flexibility to pick the sites that they find would most comfortably and efficiently provide resources to voters to come in and out as quickly as possible and exercise their vote safely and securely. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, Brad, earlier, the importance of having a robust and fully tested online voter registration system 365 days a year, especially the day of book closing, because that's usually when you have additional traffic. So that's what we're hoping to see this session, and looking forward to tracking these bills.
And Carolina, you've looked pretty closely. I know you've been talking to a lot of supervisors of elections around the state. You've been looking at their priorities. Did you want to comment on any of their priorities? I don't know if they're even public yet, but I mean, I know you've looked at those.
I mean, I can tell you this, and we heard a little bit in the hearing today. I think supervisors of elections invest, a great deal of time to make sure elections are exercised. One of the things that I think everyone is looking at very intently is, super voting sites, or some kind of flexibility to expand regional sites, leading and including election day. Wild card, I think one of the things that they supervisors were hoping was, increase the number of sites that don't typically meet the requirement of like maybe a government building or a library that tends to have, limited square footage, from 1 to 3. And so that, in a year like COVID, I think those are incredibly helpful. Ensuring voter protection is protected is one of their priorities. But I think generally, supervisors and advocacy organizations agree that building on vote by mail and early voting opportunities, voting before election day, should be easy for our voters. And then, that way we can have results much quicker on election day.
Right. Sounds good. And Kirk, did you want to weigh in? I know you spotted some problematic legislation.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I mean, my fellow panelists have identified a couple, but I would like to add to the list just a little bit. There is a measure that we've been watching, which is HJR 61, that relates to the percentage of voters that are required to approve a constitutional amendment. So right now, it's 60% of voters who vote in an election to approve an amendment, and this bill would raise that requirement to over 66%, which obviously would be problematic. It would mean that all of the measures that the senator mentioned earlier in terms of medical marijuana, Amendment 4, and a variety of the minimum wage, all of those measures would have failed despite, Floridians' clear intent that they be the law of the land. So I think we're really concerned about what that one will do in terms of, voting and, the citizens' ability to control where the state goes on certain issues. I think the other one I just wanted to emphasize is the one that was mentioned earlier, Senate Bill 90, which relates to vote by mail ballots. It's really problematic that we would limit the vote by mail request to 1 year. It would mean that every voter in 2020 would have to, that came into the process, would have to renew their vote by mail application. And clearly that's going to have the impact of driving down the number of folks who participate by vote by mail. The other one I'd like to mention is Senate Bill 774, which does relate to those super voting sites, but I wanted to mention a different aspect of that bill, which is namely about the poll watcher requirements in it. Current law says that no police, sheriff, police officers, law enforcement can serve as poll watchers, but this bill flips that around and says that in fact they can be poll watchers, which on the surface of it might sound okay, but if you are familiar with sort of voting and elections history, you'll know that up until just about this last cycle, there was a consent decree in place out of the DC District Court that went back to 1982 that prohibited poll watchers coming from law enforcement and a variety of other things like that. And so, there's a long history of voter intimidation involving police and other actors who are, part of so-called ballot protections, efforts. And so I think we're really concerned about what this bill will do in terms of poll watchers. And I think the same thing is true for Senate Bill 656 related to elections, which says that poll watchers can come from anywhere in the state, not just within the current county where a poll watcher might reside. And that's going to have the same effect where I think it incentivizes individuals who have, maybe through that disinformation, they have, a warped perspective on what's going on in our electoral system, and they're going to want to control who actually is able to get to the polls and express their preferences. I think in terms of the ACLU priorities, they match, very much what Carolina was mentioning a little bit earlier. We want to see expansion of vote by mail and early vote. I think we're also supportive of the ideas around automatic voter registration. There are a variety of ways of doing that, and I think we ought to have a robust conversation in Florida about how we get there. And we definitely need to improve the data collection and transparency around returning citizens and what's going on with their financial obligations and how they resolve those financial obligations. So those are just a few of the priorities we're going to be trying to advance this session. Back to you.
Yeah, you just covered a lot of ground. I mean, one thing I might add on the vote centers bill, it's 774 and 635. It's not just what's in the bill. There are a lot of elements missing. Vote centers can be a very positive step for the state to take if they're done right. But there are a lot of elements that need to be in those bills to make sure voters of color, historically marginalized communities aren't adversely impacted. There needs to be strong notification. From our perspective, all voting is local. We feel that there needs to be stronger notification requirements so that when those changes are made with polling places, when someone's been going to their local church for 70 years and it suddenly changes, that they're notified and they know about them. Limitations on how quickly supervisors can close down sites so that they can't consolidate polls too quickly and drastically. There should be requirements that they take public transit options into consideration. There's a whole slew of things that aren't in that bill that need to be. But I could go on and on that, so I'm going to move on. So to the panel, what do you think will actually happen this year in the legislative session? There's been a lot of news about legislation targeting vote by mail, making it harder to vote by mail, making it harder to vote early, making drop boxes illegal in other states. There's been some concern that we could see some of that here. But if you could look at the tea leaves now based on what you've seen and heard, what do you think we'll see happen this session? And I'll kick it off to the senator first.
Sure, get me in trouble. Look, I think that, we have seen across the country, nationally, that there is what I think the last report I saw is 165 bills restricting voting access across the country. That's actually 4 times more than usual. In Florida, we, again, you can't complain too much because it seems that we didn't have any issues. And I guess because we have the history of 2000 and stuff, we sort of worked on a lot of these issues already. And it's harder. Having said that, I already told you about SB 90 and some of the other bills. I do think that there is a tremendous amount. We didn't even talk, you started to talk about it, Brad, just about technology and new technology. And I think that, ethics and elections should be looking at, this is another bill that I have, and that is, with the advancements of technologies, they can use our voice, our image, to say anything. And again, because we had in this election cycle so much of the false information, I think the next thing that we're going to see is not just false, but actually recreated false videos, false voices with our voice. It's even worse because technology. And so, my bill is just to allow that if that is to go out there, there has to be a disclaimer at the beginning and at the end. And if it's, like the phone call you mentioned, right, it would have to be somewhere in the middle as well, just letting them know this has been manipulated, it's not real. And obviously the disclaimer saying who's paying for this, but I just think that we need to tackle these things before it becomes a major problem. And this is not a Republican or Democratic issue. This is something that is just anti-democracy if voters are basing their decisions on false information. So I think that is something that we should be doing. I don't know that we will, unfortunately. So I hate to be sort of pessimistic. I see that in this session, our priorities are things that are not our real problems. We have lots of real problems. Those don't seem to be the priorities, or fixing things that really need fixing, such as, fulfilling what the voters asked us to do with all of these different constitutional amendments, instead of just bringing them down or, you know, watering them down as we do every year.
I look at it as being realistic, but Carolina, did you want to?
Definitely. I will tell you that while I'm not sure what will happen in the legislature this year, I can tell you one thing, that, you know, prior to this year, and one, there's lots of conversation around vote by mail. A good 20-30 minutes of today's hearing revolved different components of vote by mail, be it the envelope, be it the drop boxes. So there's certainly at least a curiosity as to, you know, existing infrastructure. But prior to, you know, to 2020, vote by mail was not a voting method that was not uncommon to, you know, to say Republicans, for example, right? And so I think it'd be nice to see a bill crafted that didn't necessarily favor one or the other, but more just the Florida voters, right? Just general accessibility, and just building on the fact that, you know, we seem to be touted at this current time as delivering best-in-class results, being done as quickly as possible, best-in-class vote by mail. I mean, are there tweaks that can be made, you know, in terms of postage and postmark date and just you know, vote by mail drop boxes? But I'd like to see that we don't go backwards, but rather build on the existing accessibility that we have, you know, and so that'll be important. And so, you know, we certainly look forward to, you know, Senator Taddeo and, you know, the many representatives and senators that are working hard to maintain voting as accessible as possible.
Likewise. Kirk, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I think I want to make the point, maybe a sharper critique, if I may. I think what we've observed over you know, the last several cycles, and particularly out of the Amendment 4 experience, but not exclusively out of that, has been this sort of willful ignorance of the impact of some of these revisions or reforms. And they're often presented as good government. We're just housekeeping. We're cleaning things up. We're improving things incrementally. You know, we do have a good system here, which is a true statement, but that doesn't mean it can't be improved. And I think the willful ignorance part is that in those sort of housekeeping changes that get asserted, the state does not adequately look into the impact that it has on voters. And they particularly don't look into the impact that it has on African American, Hispanic, you know, Black and brown populations within the state of Florida. They don't assess, you mentioned this a moment ago, they don't adequately assess the racial impact of some of these policies. And it absolutely means that individuals in those communities are not able to vote. And so I admit I don't have a lot of confidence. I think we're going to move backwards. I think the majority is going to find ways to make bills look like they're housekeeping measures and good government measures, but the impact that they're going to have is the one that I describe. And I think we've got to push back on that at every opportunity. We certainly will here. I know my panelists colleagues have certain other limitations to how they can do it, but we're going to be robust and loud about saying that the state needs to do better about accounting for the impact on Floridians. Back to you.
I agree with parts of what everyone said. I mean, I think we'll definitely. I mean, they aren't being shy. Just the SB 7, you know, Senator Baxley's bill SB 90 is a good example. They're already coming out with legislation that will make it harder for voters to participate in the process without a real good justification. And you know, given all the other issues they're pursuing aggressively that could be perceived as anti-voter or anti-democracy, I kind of wonder how thinly they'll veil it. But, you know, I did hear some things today in the Public Integrity and Elections Committee that give me hope that there could be some good done on reporting. And, you know, the state doesn't have a lot of strong requirements for the supervisors as far as reporting and, you know, to the state where it's aggregated and made public. We, just like reporters, are often forced to, you know, submit public records requests and wait for months, if not years, to get the data. It's often, it comes to us in different formats where it's very difficult to process and use in a way where we can figure out where problems exist and then work with supervisors to address them. So that's one area I saw some maybe some synergy with leadership. But yeah, we're bracing with low expectations. I think we would love to see them address the online voter registration system. Just as Senator Taddeo was flagging, that was completely predictable that the system would break down. They've been warned time and time again, and hopefully they're taking the steps to make sure it doesn't happen again, like a third-party stress test or load test to make sure they can handle additional usage during book closing deadlines and high use periods. That's just one example of an obvious thing they could do, and make those results and the standards available. Expanding early voting options, vote by mail drop boxes. We're a little worried about the security. It's obvious that they have an appetite to do something around Dropbox security. So I think it's going to be something to watch to make sure they're not making them more difficult for supervisors to set up. And then I think, again, the super voting sites, I think it's the devil's in the details. If it's done right, it could be a really good step forward. If not, it could be a problem. So those are my 2 cents. And as far as the public goes, I mean, for those who don't know, you can monitor the legislative process. You can track bills on both the Florida House and Florida Senate websites. They have tracking tools you can sign up for, and you'll get email alerts when your bills are being heard. You can watch the bill hearings on the Florida channel. It's a little confusing how they've set up the COVID protocols. If you actually want to go and testify in person, it's kind of a lost opportunity. They could have set it up where you could testify virtually, but they've decided to make it where you have to testify either in person in the House, sign up ahead of time, and you basically can go. Hopefully you can get into the room if you show up early enough. If not, you go into an overflow room and they'll pull you in when it's your turn. In the Senate, they're basically having people go to the Civic Center several blocks away from the Capitol. And all that's online on the respective websites. Does anybody else have any tips that people watching this can use to participate in the process?
Well, what I was going to say, like, when you start tracking, it's not a bad idea. One, if you're not register to vote. Make sure your registration record is actually active, right, with your current address and party affiliation. And if you want to request a mail ballot, do it. But in terms of legislation, if you have concerns or thoughts on particular bills, contact your legislator, right? That's probably the best way. Have your voice be heard. Contact your supervisor of elections. I mean, these are professionals that have decades of experience beneath their belt. That they're a great advocate in line to legislators as well. So I mean, those are 2 great ways to get involved as well.
And we're getting a little short on time, so we do have one question from the press. Steve Bosquet is asking about a comment in the Public Integrity and Elections Committee today. He says there was talk in the House Committee today of requiring a photo ID for everyone who votes by mail. Current law requires photo ID for mail voting only the first time someone votes. So I don't know if anyone has immediate thoughts or response to that.
I mean, I just dropped in there that Senate Bill 656, part of that particular bill would actually limit or restrict the photo ID use from like address confirmation. So as bills are being filed, photo ID seems to be like one of those areas that we are tracking.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yes. Well, I mean, it just seems like it's an old tune we've heard one too many times about the photo ID, and it's understandable, but at the same time, it clearly affects people who are less able. I mean, most people that don't drive don't necessarily always have an ID, and things like that. So it's just not necessarily something that works for everyone. And so it does sort of, I mean, we need to make sure to figure out a way to make sure everyone can get an ID. It's also cost money to get an ID in Florida, and we keep raising it. Because somehow we got to raise more revenues. And of course, it has to come from regular folks. So again, you're limiting ways, and I'm not against showing something that you are who you are, of course, but at the same time, it does create all kinds of problems. And I know no one will speak better or know more about this than ACLU, but definitely I think it's always been a concern because of that. And it's something that just comes up every time.
Kirk, did you want to?
Brad, since I got a call out there, can I jump in and say, so first of all, thank you to the senator, and fully agree with the point that she's making about access by, frankly, Black and brown communities, and whether or not they're able to get IDs, and we know what that looks like. That's definitely a problem, and will again have that impact that I described earlier. The other thing I would mention, though, is that the states are supposed to be laboratories of democracy, right? Florida has certainly been one of those, but there are other laboratories around the country, including Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, all of who have nearly universal vote by mail and don't require voter ID, and they don't have significant, in fact, they don't have any fraud problems of which I'm aware. And so this notion that somehow we need to have photo ID to make vote by mail either functional or safe is just wrong. And so obviously we would oppose, any proposal in that direction. And I think we've got better examples. Like Florida can do better. We can do better than Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, and we ought to try.
Yeah, and just to tip hat, the ACLU did a great report looking at a lot of those issues just last year, right? Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Kirk just said. I mean, it's a problem in search of a solution. Or it's a solution in search of a problem. I got that backwards. I mean, it's just not an issue, and it's fueled by a myth of voter fraud, and we would oppose it. I don't know. Are there any other questions from the press? Okay, well, we're a little over time. One last call. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. This will be posted online and distributed soon. Senator Taddeo, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us. Kirk, always a pleasure. Carolina, thank you. And thank you for all the reporters who joined us today.
Thank you for doing this.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.